Welcome to First in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, the Hand of Adonai series, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Alton Gansky, coming to you from my solitude of fortress, my fortress of solitude. Got to get the right word order there. In Fresno. And I'm the author of the fourth book in the Harbinger series, as well as the novel Wounds and other novels, and a couple of nonfiction books as well. Hello, Aaron.
Hello, Pops. Your Fortress of Solitude, making a Superman reference, huh? On the week of the Avengers 2 release, you're making a DC reference?
I am.
Can we have that?
I am. But, well, you've got Flash on television, so that's a DC comic. So
you got Arrow on television as well. You got Daredevil on Netflix.
That's right. But that's also Marvel, I think.
Yeah, Arrow's DC. So welcome to Comic Talk, Comic Cast. We're your hosts. A buddy of mine actually used to do a comic book podcast, and I sat in on a few of those episodes. A lot of fun those are, and maybe we'll have an episode on the merits of comic books in our current society, etc. So
that's a form of fiction.
It is. It's selling now. Back in the day, it didn't used to sell, at least not to the same extent. But I remember growing up, comic books weren't nearly as big as they are now. So, hooray for Hollywood! But some good stuff out there. So anyhow, that's not our topic.
Well, watch this little segue into this topic and sit there and be amazed. One of the reasons that when I was a young man and a kid reading comic books, I lean more towards the Marvel comic books than the DC. I read them all, but I like the Marvel ones more. And the reason is their characters had more emotion.
Right.
Spider-Man, for example, that teenage angst, and he's in college. I think initially he started in high school, but he's in college, and he has no friends, and he's always sort of the outcast. And now he's got this thing that makes him sort of a freak, but it also empowers him, and the ups and downs. And I remember others having to deal with having a secret identity and what it did to their personal life. And they just delved more into emotions of their superheroes, which DC at the time was not doing. So outside of having, Superman wink at Lois Lane every once in a while.
Which was scandalous. Just
scandalous.
Scandalous. Nice segue, by the way. But I'll mention this. I do listen to a few podcasts on comic books and the like, and can't remember who said it, but somebody was mentioning that Marvel is men among gods. They're these average people kind of fighting these overwhelming odds, whereas DC was more gods among men. And so your heroes were, almost godlike in their power. And so the focus, I think, especially with these new movies that they're doing with Batman, with the new Superman coming out, and the last one, the Man of Steel, and they're really trying to focus, I think, on how humanity is reacting to having this godlike character running around their backyard. So it's kind of an interesting twist on it, and I thought that's a unique spin. I hadn't thought about that before. I always gravitated toward Marvel for much the same reasons. The characters seem to be better developed and have some more real life problems, and their emotions seemed a little bit more on par. So
it's evened out, and they've even comic books have gotten to where they're showing more and more emotion and the struggle between doing bad things for good reasons and those sorts of things. So it's never going to be, I don't think, high literature, but it is nonetheless interesting. A lot of action, of course. That's what it's based on.
I'm going to insert real quick, and then we'll get to our publishing term and actually get on with our topic. But there is an episode, I guess, an issue rather, of an Amazing Spider-Man, and it's just a black cover, and I think it's the one that was published after the Twin Towers fell. So it's back in released in 2001. I'm sure you should look it up. I think everyone should look that up and read that comic. You can buy it digitally on your phone if you want to, through Comixology or the Marvel app, whatever it is. I think it may have been free for a time. It may still be free, but You mentioned it may not ever be high literature, but that, you want to talk about emotion and some really well crafted prose and kind of the ideology that goes through it. And there's some real tangible emotion that goes through it. I didn't think a comic book would ever make me cry, but I mean, this was well done, very very poignant, very
Yeah, I
very
know
poignant.
a little bit about the story behind that, and they did want to delve into the emotion. And they used Spider-Man because Spider-Man is technically in New York,
Hmm.
and so since New York was the city that was attacked, he was the natural lead in this thing. And it's not unusual for comic books to do that. They often address issues. They're usually specialty issues. They try to bring some social bearing into it, but the contemporary comic book is vastly different than what I was reading when I was a kid. It's really an adult medium now. It's not so much a kid's medium as it was
Yeah,
when I first started reading them.
yeah, I agree. They've really matured, I think, with their audience in a way. It's a pretty dramatic way, just that I was able to see from the time that I collected as a kid. You got me into them and taught me the love and appreciation for them, and then I kind of sank further in after that. So I think I can really blame you for that. So all the money I spend on comic books now, I'm just going to send you a bill.
Well, it's the first time you listen to me, so I'm glad to have had that effect.
you, you didn't anticipate that, did you?
It was the only time, you've ever paid attention to it. I like what Tess DeGroot says. She reads mostly DC because of strong women characters. I had thought about that, but that's true, especially starting with Wonder Woman.
Mhm.
Not just Wonder Woman, but there are others. But she probably kind of leads that parade and stuff.
Yeah,
But as you say, enough of that.
we could probably sit here all night long talking
Don't,
about this.
don't get me started. Yeah.
Oh my goodness! All right, we got to get on track here. If you're enjoying this conversation and you'd like for us to speak at length about the literary merits of comic books, let us know, man. If it's something in the comics, we'll set up a week where we just talk some informal talk of comic books, and maybe I'll see if I can get a guest on, my buddy of mine, Nathan, who's big into comics. It could be a lot of fun. Anyhow, that's neither here nor there, but let us know. And for now, let's turn our attention back to the publishing term, and then we'll get started with our topic for tonight. So our publishing term from last week that we mentioned was the difference between a novel, a novella, a novelette, et cetera, et cetera. So what are the guidelines? My fly friend is back. I am so in love with flies. What are the guidelines, Pops, for novels and novellas, et cetera?
Well, they're defined by length, and in writing, length is usually stated in words, not pages. And in my earlier writing, I did have one publisher, and I was writing book length work, and I would get a contract and say the contract would say that the book would be 350 pages. Well, if I'm using 14-point type, I'm done a lot earlier than I am if I'm using 12-point type. So that was the only company I ever worked with that did that, and they changed that very soon because pages can mean anything. So it's usually done by word count, and we came up with this last week because we were talking about something else somewhat related, but how long is long? So you'll get different numbers depending who you talk to, but it'll break down something like this. Short fiction, short stories, generally considered anything under 7,500 words. 7,500 words. And so that's short. That's what you get in short story anthologies and the like. Excuse me just a second. So I get for eating right before I come in here. 7,500 words. Of course, you want to get into flash fiction and stuff like that. It's much more reduced than that. But short fiction, anything under 7,500 words. You won't see this term very much except in the science fiction world because it's one of their classifications for the Hugo Awards and other awards. And that's the novelette. Which is the diminutive of novel. Novelette, 7,500 words to 17,500 words. Now, how many pages is that? If you're using a standard manuscript, you get about 300 words per page. Times New Roman, double spaced, 1-inch margins. It's about 300 a page. If you're doing something silly like using Courier, then it's about 250. So you just divide by 300. A novella, which is a thin book, I did here with Harbingers, the fourth book, and you see it's very thin. These run 17,500 to about 40,000. This one is roughly 20,000 words. I ran long. These are supposed to be about 15, but I don't know how to shut up. So 17,500 to 40,000 gives you a novella, and a novel is anything over 40,000. And then you can get even larger with that. Most novels in most genres are going to run over 80,000. Romances, westerns, cozy mysteries are shorter, but about 80,000 to 100,000. A little longer, 120 if you have, a thriller. If you're getting into fantasy writing, it can be a whole bunch more. And fantasy readers love the long book.
Yeah, they're patient readers.
Yeah, and it's more of an experience, I think, for fantasy readers. Sci-fi can be somewhat long, but it can also be short, so it doesn't follow the fantasy trend.
Yeah, it also depends on the market you're writing for. If you're writing for the YA market specifically, some of those numbers are a little bit reduced in context of a novel. Not all YA books are 80,000 plus words. You'll find some of those clocking in around 65, 75. But usually they're going to be, around that 80 mark.
Yeah, I often thought that, and I thought that for a long time, but the Harry Potter books kind of broke that mold and did YA books that were much longer. So she wasn't the first to do that, but really kind of set a trend that YA books could be much longer because young adults, teenagers and stuff who like to read don't mind reading the long books. So everything's done in word count, and that's how you break them down. So novel's going to be over 40,000, and if you're really going to do a standard novel, suspense, a regular mystery, police, procedural, something like that, I think you need to be over 80,000. If you're doing a romance, maybe less, westerns less, but you're going to be over 80,000, and I think 90,000 is the sweet spot for most genres, not all. Some need to be longer.
1995, somewhere in there. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that's novels and novellas and novelettes. Good stuff there. Today we're talking about emotion, and the title is Sentiment Without Sentimentality. How do you write about emotion without delving into purple prose and the melodrama? So that's what we're talking about today. It's a tricky line to walk. There's a balancing act, as there is with a lot of fiction. You can usually tell a gifted writer because they walk those lines well. They understand the balance between sentiment and sentimentality. They know when to show and when not to show, etc. So you started here, Pops. You found a pretty interesting quote here. And what did you got? What do you have for us there?
Well, I did something that was interesting and a little surprising to me, Aaron. I went through a lot of my fiction writing books and tried to look up emotion. Not one of them had a chapter on use of emotion. They would sometimes have a paragraph or two dealing in character, but the subject is seldom approached at any length in the how-to books. But I did find a piece by Kim Edwards in Creating Fiction. Creating Fiction, the 1999 book, is a collection of essays by writers. Kim Edwards wrote short stories for the most part. She said perhaps the most important truth to begin with is the authentic transfer of emotion. I like that phrase. The authentic transfer of emotion from author to character. Even when an author has not experienced what her character is experiencing, she can find parallel events and emotions in her own life on which to draw. And I thought it was a great quote, this authentic transfer. And that's what we're doing as writers. We're transferring some of our emotions, even though we might be fabricating them in a particular situation. We have to somehow get that into our characters.
And I want to throw something else out here. I like you say, I'm enamored with that expression, the transfer, the authentic transfer of emotion. Nobody wants it if it's not genuine. But I also think that there might be a bit of an exchange rate. We tend to feel emotion, and it's pretty profound for us. It's pretty formative. the emotion that we feel in our lives, and we have these moments of high emotion that we can look back on and say, this was a defining moment in my life, it led me down this path, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can recall those moments, but sometimes if you go overboard with trying to explain this particular emotion and the depth of that particular emotion, I think that's when we get to some of that melodrama. So I almost think that there might be, in this transfer of emotion, I think there might be a bit of an exchange rate, finding the exchange rate. How much do you put in and how much do you keep back, to establish kind of that balance that we've talked about?
Yeah, melodrama is a good term. I'm glad you used that. And just so that everyone knows what melodrama is, it's over-the-top acting. And there's a style of acting called melodrama. There used to be, not far outside of Ojai, California, in Santa Paula, I think it was, and they had a theater devoted to melodrama. And they would encourage you, the audience, to boo, to hiss, to say things back to the characters. And if you didn't, they'd stop the play. Okay, that's fine for that kind of thing. But in a book, it can become too much, and it destroys really the writer's reputation. I'll give you an example of that. I was asked to endorse a book once, and I was reading about the characters, and they were both spies, CIA-type spies. One was a woman, one was a man. They'd had a relationship some time back, and she gave birth to his child, but never told him about it. So he doesn't know the child exists. They're traveling in a car. And here they are, highly trained professionals, both with college degrees and stuff. And she goes on this little internal dialogue piece where it's almost as though she's putting her hand to her head saying, oh, why won't he ask me about the son he has that he doesn't know about? And at that point, I was done. It just was not realistic to her character. It was really a stupid thing to think, because she's kept it secret, so it's really her fault. But she's wanting to blame him, and the whole book fell apart at that point. So you can go over the top and lose your readers. By the same token, you can be such a cheapskate with emotion that the readers never connect with your characters, more than in some, shallow way. So you have to have some emotion, I think, in books.
I agree with that completely. And I would also kind of come back to that quote and then focus on the word authentic. And then the example that you just gave, this emotion didn't ring true. We use that expression, didn't ring true. It wasn't earned. I think we can simply say it's inauthentic. This is not something that she would feel at this point. This is an emotion that was specifically put in there by the author. It's not something that the character would naturally feel. And anytime you as a writer are putting in an emotion to a character that would not naturally feel that emotion, that's an inauthentic transfer of emotion. And readers will find that out very quickly. If your character is not behaving in such a way that lines up with their particular emotional state, or if they feel a way that is not warranted by what you've already established in the story, readers will call foul. And they will be very quick to put the book down. It breaks believability at that point, and like you say, it can really cost you as a writer.
Yeah, it appears disingenuous, or it appears to the reader that you're trying to manipulate them, and no one wants their emotions manipulated. People don't mind you tapping into their emotions or raising their emotions, but they do not want to be manipulated in their emotions. And it's one of the hallmarks of the new writer is they're trying to get you to feel something, so they will really go over the top to sell. And sometimes less is more. This is one of those where if you get the emotions right and you express it correctly, appropriate to the characters, age, and gender, then it will carry more weight than you can imagine.
Absolutely. And I believe it's Chekhov who says, when you want to depict sad or unlucky people, try to be cold. It gives the reader, it gives the sadness, as it were, a background. Yes, you must be cold. And so the idea there is we talk a lot about show, don't tell, show, don't tell. When it comes to emotion, too much showing can really harm you. Again, it goes back to this manipulation and the overwritten purple prose and the melodrama, etc. Instead, what you're trying to find is that subtlety. You're trying to find one or two details that are going to accurately and efficiently convey the specific emotion that your character is, feeling at that moment in such a way that it transfers to the reader.
Yeah, and the show versus tell thing is the tendency is to want to write, he was angry. Well, that's telling, it's not showing. I've been going through Ray Bradbury's A Pleasure to Burn based on the Fahrenheit 451, but they're all stories. It's not the same story, but it surrounds that. And I was just thinking that I was at a portion where somebody's wife upsets him and he's angry, but Bradbury doesn't tell us he's angry. Instead, the guy jumps up from the table and points his finger and raises his voice, and that's showing. He doesn't say he was angry, so he jumped up from the table and slammed his hand down and pointed his finger and screamed at the top of his lungs. He stood up, and I think it's just very simple. He says whatever he says, and it just says he shouted, and that's enough. We don't have to know that. We don't have to be told he's angry. He's shown us he's angry. Same thing with sadness, tears, sobbing, shoulders heaving, blurry vision, that sort of thing. That will give us an idea that they're crying. You don't have to say that necessarily that she began to cry.
Right, exactly. And once you give like something about the slumped shoulders, maybe would be good. I find myself I will have my characters wipe their cheeks with their hands or with their sleeve or something like that, and that's because I'm never a fan of they cried or the tears were streaming down their cheeks or whatever. It always felt very purple to me, and so I've tried to avoid that, and so I've tried to find very specific ways to demonstrate that they have been crying or they are upset in some way without her tears fell like rain and puddled up until a flood of whatever, and all the kind of tired cliche images of connecting tears to water just kind of seems overdone. So rather than that, I actually shy away from figurative language when we're dealing with sorrow. And I will also say that sorrow is it's not a solitary emotion. People are seldom sad for the sake of sadness. Instead, they're sorrowful because. So there's usually some other emotion that's weighing on them. Current example from my current work in progress is the father whose estranged son has passed away, and he's racked not just with sorrow about the passing of his son, but the fact that he hasn't talked to his son in 22 years, that he could have done something about it. So there's this guilt, this intense guilt and regret that keeps coming back and kind of punching at him and gnawing at him, which results in his sorrow. But it's not the sorrow that I lead with, because the sorrow is just a byproduct of his regret of the choices that he's made in his life.
And you're certainly right that emotions usually don't travel alone. There'll usually be a primary emotion, but there's often other emotions. So sadness can be prompted by guilt. So there you have two emotions. Throw in a little regret, and that will be more fuel for the sadness. And of course, you can use any emotion with that. It's also interesting some of the way you describe that. Emotion is always described in physical terms, and we talked about this a while back on a different topic with emotion. But emotion is emotion, and that is it's motion within. So it's an inner response, and we sense it physically. So when we're in love, we get that little ooey gooey thing in our stomach, or if we're frightened, the heart pounds or scratches at our the rib cage, and so on. There's always a physical kind of response to that. And it's also different, and this is where some writers get into trouble. It's different between men and women. Men and women don't always share the same emotional set, or at least their expression of it. They have the same emotions, but the way they express them is a little different. And with men, age has something to do with it. The older men get, they tend to get more emotional. They tend towards sadness, and that sadness will move them to tears, where it wouldn't have done that when they were, say, 50 or 40. So sometimes you have to factor age in too, in getting these physical responses.
Now, Are you bringing this up because you were just crying at the long distance commercial before the show? Is that why you bring this up?
Long distance commercial.
No.
No.
Is reference to an old joke. Okay. So
no.
that joke didn't have wings. That joke did not fly. Yeah, you try sometimes, you win, you lose, and that one lost. Yes, but age has something to do with it. And I tend to think that maybe the reason men become more emotional as they age is kind of this culmination of all the emotions that they've been experiencing throughout their lives, and it, in our culture, we tend to revere the strong men, the strapping heroes, and that they don't get sad, they don't cry, they just kind of stuff their emotions, etc. And so men have been notoriously bad at expressing their emotions, and when that's not to say they don't feel emotion, they just tend to try not to project their emotions as much, especially things like sadness, which that might be, or fear, which might be construed as weakness. And if they want to present a strong front, they'll tend to stuff. So men tend to stuff their emotions. And I think as you age, there's only so much that you can internalize before something has to give. And so I think that might be one reason why that as you grow older, you become a little more emotional. But it's also important to remember that you don't have to wait. Your character doesn't have to be, 65 or 70 before they become emotional. If you think about the postal workers, and this is the example, going postal. I don't know if that's an appropriate term to use or not, but those who tend to snap, right? The ones who keep swallowing their emotion are usually the ones who have some sort of outburst. And because they don't know how to regulate their emotions. So that's an interesting thing to look at. If your character is a stuffer, and it could be male or female, typically more men do this than women, but if they're a stuffer, it doesn't mean that they don't experience that emotion. It just means they bury it. And the actual act of burying that can have some pretty profound impacts on your character psychologically and even biologically. You start thinking about things like ulcers, that come from stress, the lack of sleep. In some extreme cases, I think I could be wrong here, but I've heard about people's hair falling out when they get very stressed out. Those types of things comes from like this internalization without a healthy outlet to express these emotions. So that's something else to keep in mind as you're writing about your characters. Is this somebody who stuffs their emotions and buries it, or is this somebody who's going to be a lot freer to express their emotions? I'll give this example, and if I can get a little bit personal here, my wife and I, if I'm a little irritated about something, I get real quiet, and I don't necessarily give her the silent treatment, but I'm not exactly pursuing conversation. And she's had to talk to me before, and she says, "Look, you can't do the silent treatment thing. You can't, ignore me. You've got to talk to me, because if you don't, then I start to think that he's hiding something, or he's mad at me. And why is he mad at me? He shouldn't be mad at me. I didn't do anything wrong. How dare he be mad at me? Is it about this? I can't believe he'd be mad at me about this." And before you know it, she's stewing in some sort of anger when all I'm thinking about is, who are the Buccaneers going to draft tomorrow night? Are they going to trade down? And I can't believe he's angry at me. So she's getting herself worked up, and I'm just off in la la land. So that kind of communication, keep that in mind with your characters. Are they communicating their emotions? Why or why not? And what's the impact that they have in their relationships? How does their emotion affect not only them, but those who are around them as well? This is another consideration to think of.
Yeah, and biochemistry, going back to as men age, they get a little more emotional. Part of it's biochemistry. There's less testosterone being produced. They've also been probably taking it on the chin longer than young men have, and after a while that begins to accumulate. Medications, if you have a character who's on medications or is an alcoholic or a drug addict of some sort, or is got a medical condition that requires some medication, some of those medications lead to depression and other things. Just watch the ads on television. This will help you go to the bathroom. Of course, it may lead to suicidal tendencies. And you think, well, boy, I don't know. I don't know if I want to risk my life for something like that. But
yeah.
the
How
side
about
effects of those.
the antidepressants with the side effects of suicidal thoughts? It's like, well, I'm taking this so that I won't be depressed, and yet I'm going to take it and now I want to kill myself. Like, that just seems like a bad deal. Like, that's a pretty big red flag.
Yeah, and that's the strange thing about biochemistry, because some antidepressants should not be taken by young people, like teenagers, because it makes them suicidal. I've always wondered about this, but you can get it for adults, which is fine. And I'm wondering, how in the world does the pill know your age? Well, I'm sure there's some biochemical reason behind that's going on. The pharmacists know what they're doing, but I've always wondered, does this pill know I'm old enough now, or am I going to be suicidal? Well, anyway, characters can be drastically affected as well, emotionally, as well as by things they've seen. You don't expect people coming back from war to be the same as when they went off to war. They're very much not, especially if they're frontline people, or they've had to do things that haunt them at night. You don't expect a mother who has lost a child to be the same as she was before she lost the child. Especially these days, we live in an age where losing a child is fairly uncommon. Back in when our country was being founded, you lost normally half your children. It was just to be expected. Half of them were going to die. So that's why they had so many children. And then it usually ended up costing the mother's life, but that's a whole other thing going along there. These things will affect people. Positive things. I mean, they might first seem positive. You win the lottery, woohoo! But then what happens? And that changes people. And so there's any number of outside events that will toy with the emotions. Few of us are so controlled that we can delineate all that and say, well, this is the problem, and I'm just going to ignore that now. So.
A couple great story recommendations. One is called "Why Soldiers Don't Talk" by Steinbeck. I don't think it's fiction. It might actually be a nonfiction piece. I haven't read it in years. I'd have to double check it, but I'm pretty sure it's Steinbeck. "Why Soldiers Don't Talk." Great piece that really touches on what you were talking about there. When a man goes to war, you don't expect him to come back the same. Sure. Tim O'Brien has, in The Things They Carried, man, so many great stories that revolve around that particular issue. Just if you want to get into the male mind, The Things They Carried does a fantastic job of it, and how men react to war and how they come back from war, and the relationships that they make with each other and with other people outside who have not gone to war. Some really profound stuff. I was going to tell a quick story on, you were talking about antidepressants, and I've never slept well. I haven't slept well in decades. And so in the process of trying to fix my sleep, one of my doctors prescribed me, I can't remember what it was called now, but I think it was nortriptyline or something. It's an antidepressant, but it's supposed to help me sleep. And when I went to pick up the prescription, this short little nurse is filling out the prescription, and she goes, okay, I'm giving you this pill for depression. I wasn't depressed before, but I kind of am now. Like, that was really brutal.
That's it. It affects your memory. You're remembering those kinds of things, and you always will. And you're right. These outside events will live with a character forever. And when I say character, I mean real people. You might recall Chuck Carney. The people listening will know who Chuck Carney is. But Chuck Carney, in many ways, is a naval hero. He got an accommodation from Nimitz during World War II. He had 3 ships shot out from under him. And that was always our joke. Nobody would go fishing with him because they're afraid the boat would sink from beneath them. So, but he still couldn't talk about some of those. And it's not because he was sworn to secrecy. He just could not emotionally deal with it anymore. I had another acquaintance who was during World War II, he was a pilot, a bomber pilot. And he lost his whole crew. And he's the nicest guy until you get close to that. And then he was just a basket case, and he would not talk about it. He became too emotional to even talk about anything going on in the war years. Well, now it doesn't have to be war. It can be any number of things. It could be part of a crime that's been committed. It could be maybe something positive that happens, but it changes people. That means your characters are going to have to change in some realistic way.
So you do want to consider the emotional history, like we say, of your character. Think about whatever baggage, we use the term baggage. What baggage are they coming into the story with? Now, you don't have to show the loss of the child. You don't have to show the firefights in war. You don't have to show any of that. If your story, if that's all happened beforehand, it's something that they still carry with them. So it's worth asking yourself the question: what three formative emotional moments have affected my character? What tragedies and or successes and or insecurities do they have? What is their most embarrassing moment? What is their greatest triumph? What is their greatest defeat? What are they afraid of? These are the types of things to ask yourself, because then when your character comes on screen, so to speak, comes on the page, they're going to be acting and behaving in a particular way. I want to give the example. I was reading a book a friend of mine wrote, and in it, there's a son, and it's told from the son's perspective. He's got a little sister. Things happen, and the relationship between the sister and the brother is he doesn't like her. She's annoying. She likes annoying him. So they just don't really get along. You see her about 4 times, and then she dies. And then after that, he's just, he goes off the deep end, and he's mad at the world, and the inhumanity of it, and blah blah blah, and it just really tears the character up. And my comments were that this emotional outburst from him was not earned, because the only time we see him interacting with his sister is, I don't like you. And so what I encouraged him to do was to find some quiet moments with him and his sister where they can both be vulnerable with each other, confide in each other, their deepest, darkest fears, whatever it is, to have some sort of bond between the two that, yeah, they fight on the outside. What siblings don't? But when you get down to it, there's that old saying, I can make fun of my brother, but you can't make fun of my brother. Where's that brotherly protection? I don't see that anywhere in the novel. And so my comments were, this isn't earned. This sadness that your character is experiencing isn't earned. And I suggested on the revision that he consider just to keep in mind that every time that sister is on the scene, that it's really a corpse. And here's this corpse walking and talking. And, you've got to front load that. You've got to get the readers ready to mourn with your character if you want your characters to mourn. So you've got to do some work beforehand. If you've got some sort of major emotional event, don't just drop it on the reader and surprise. It's got to be worked up toward, so that when your character mourns, we mourn. When your character rejoices, we rejoice. And we can't do that without the proper establishing of that foundation there.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that's going to be most important for new writers to learn, is that you have to trust your readers to insert the emotion. For me, the great example is the 6-word contest. Can you tell a story in 6 words? And Ernest Hemingway's famous for sale, period, baby shoes, period, never worn, period. Okay. He mentions no emotion, but man, those 6 words, for anybody who's a parent, just rips the heart out. But he's not conjured up any emotion. He just made a 6-word statement. But we can fill in the rest of it. We don't have to know the details. We just know that there's been a loss, and there's a great sadness in those 6 words, as well as the rest of the story is how bad off do you have to be to sell baby shoes?
Right.
Whatever the problem was implies that maybe the parents have even other problems beyond that. So, and that in just 6 words.
Absolutely. And it comes from a trust. I've mentioned this before, trusting the reader is the sign of a competent and confident writer. When you know that your audience is intelligent enough to pick up what you're putting down, there's a certain joy and satisfaction in that as a reader. To know that you're not being pandered to, that you're not being talked down to, or condescended toward, however you say that. there's a beauty in that kind of trust. And you really have to rely on that when you get to these emotional moments. You really have to trust them. Uh, if you don't, you're going to end up overwriting. So one of the things that you can do in the editing process is to go back through and say, have I already said this? We're writers, we're people of words and language. And so this goes for all areas, not just emotional writing, but I think that we tend to do this a lot in the emotional moments. We tend to overwrite, especially on first drafts. And we go into the purple prose and the melodrama. That's fine in the first draft, because what you're doing is you are seeking to find the right words to convey that emotion efficiently, right? So you're going to say the same thing about 4, 5, 6 different times with different words. And that's fine, as long as on the revision process, you go back and you take 5 of them out. You don't need 6 different descriptions of sadness. You just need the right one. And so don't be afraid to, when we start talking about like avoiding melodrama and purple prose, don't be afraid to do that on your first draft. But on your second draft, you got to make sure you're reading with that very critical eye that says, have I already said this once or twice? Is there a better way to say this? Is this too telling, or is it overshowing? In what way can I find that happy medium?
And often less is more, again. And it takes a deft hand. You really have to practice. And I think the thing for writers to remember, especially new writers, is just get it down. Get the first draft done. Then you can go back and say, okay, I'm over the top on this, or maybe I need a little more heat here, or I need a little more love in this particular scene, or but then you can go back and do the balancing. It's hard to do things perfect first time, unless you're Dean Koontz, who writes one page until it's perfect, then he writes page number 2 until it's perfect and rewrites it, and so on. Very few of us can do that and maintain our sanity. So it is a challenge for writers to describe emotion without using the old hackneyed phrases. And it's hard to do. Now, have you ever read anything where the narrator brought the emotion to the story? Or the narration sets the story, third person, sets the tone, sets the emotional backdrop, just in the way the scene is described?
Well, my first instinct is Carver and Hemingway, but I had already been thinking about them and the fact that they're what we would call minimalists, and they're very sparse with their language. And with Hemingway, you rarely got any sort of explanation of emotions. You just got the dialogue that shows it. And Carver, in one of my favorite pieces, Popular Mechanics, there's a line that some argue probably shouldn't be in there, but it says, the outside cars were driving through the slushy street. It was getting dark, but it was getting dark on the inside too. Okay, thanks for that. Felt kind of like an authorial intrusion. And then the rest of the story is just horrific. It's absolutely horrifying, because of the lack of detail in the emotional states, but the very accurate showing of the emotional states of the 2 people involved, or rather the 3 people involved. It's a story that will not ever leave you. So that would be the first one where I could think of where the third person narrator is trying to establish kind of the emotion. Did you have something in mind?
Yeah, I've been going through the Ray Bradbury books, as I mentioned earlier, or really the short stories, and he borderlines on purple prose. And we've used that term several times, and I've noticed a couple of people calling it an interesting term. Just to make sure somebody listening down the line who doesn't know what purple prose is, it's overwritten material. It's you just go on and use a lot of modifiers and a lot of descriptors, and you spend a lot of time describing it, and it's usually referred to as purple prose. And you can take that out. Now, Ray Bradbury comes very close to this, but he is so good that to take it away would lessen the story. And so really I'm doing this with an audio book, Audible, and I'm listening to this book. And so I have the reader's voice in my ear, and it's just fabulous. And what I've discovered now that I'm most of the way through this thing is that he, through the narrator, can set the tone and the emotion for the protagonist without doing so directly. So they're burning books, and in one case they're going to burn this whole house down, but they started where the books are upstairs, and the firemen who no longer put out fires, they start fires, and they do so they have hoses that squirt kerosene, and they set the books on fire. But he would do things like he described the burning of the books as they would fall from above, like blackened butterflies, and how the curtains burned and stuff. And of course, it's close to this character, this protagonist, but when you listen to this, when you read this, you think, okay, this is what this guy's feeling, and it's dark, and it's sad, and it's depressing, and he never says the character is depressed or sad or upset, but he does show it through the course of the story. So he would be a great one to study for that. It's a little older now, and remember, sci-fi, older stuff, golden age stuff, a lot of science fiction was still being invented. So you have Arthur C. Clarke, who over-narrates. You have Ray Bradbury, who gets close to purple prose, but he's so talented, it's not purple prose. They all do their job very, very well, but contemporary writing's a little different, so you have to be very good if you're going to do that.
I think a lot of that, he's using the setting there to establish the tone and the mood. He's using his figurative language, which he's just masterful at, and the words that he chooses. Like you say, he's just spot on, and you could argue that he's close to over-explaining and bordering on that purple prose, but his descriptions are not hackneyed, they're not cliche, they're fresh and they're original, and they're shocking and they're dramatic, and they're so exact, so efficient. I mean, it's just with the precision of language that he wields, it's startling. And so these images come to life in a way that is very clear and absolutely creates that emotion within the reader without having to say, this is what the character is feeling. As a matter of fact, I don't even think he goes into that much. You can get, he does the same thing in Fahrenheit 451. He's got this incredible span of like 2 or 3 pages where it's just the greatest imagery and figurative language. It's almost a prose poem. It's gorgeous as this house is burning, and it talks about like the books closing like hands, and just personifies the books, opened and screaming. Just some fantastic stuff. This is one thing that I would highly recommend. We've said it before, but I don't think we actually say it enough. You have to read. You have to read if you really want to find that balance. I don't know a better teacher than those who are already good at it. So picking up those books of great literary quality, that are just spot on with it. Try it out. Try a little Ray Bradbury, and then temper it with a little Raymond Carver. So you see the minimalist, and then you see the kind of the more overwritten, if you will. Fitzgerald went to town on his imagery and figurative language, and then read a Hemingway book to see how he handled it. 2 very different writers, very different styles, both very good at what they do. Your style is probably going to fall somewhere in between. You might lean more toward one than the other. That's fine. But finding your own natural voice and how you do it is pretty important too. And I think that's one of the best ways to discover your voice is to try out other people's voices, if you will. To write like a Fitzgerald, to write like a Hemingway, to write like a Carver, to write like a Bradbury, and then see what comes out. And some you're going to like, and some you're going to hate. But eventually, you'll find some middle ground where I think you'll find that you can establish that balance of emotion, like you need to do.
I agree 100% with that. That you have to read. I'm never more inspired to write than when I read. Unless I'm reading somebody of the quality of Bradbury. He gets dismissed because he's early science fiction. And how serious is science fiction? Well, it's very serious. A lot of people don't realize that. He makes me want to quit because it's like being in a race around a track at school or something like that, and you realize I'm going to come in 10th in a race of 9 people. There's just no way I'm going to be able to keep up with this. But then at the same time, I start analyzing it. And he does something that I think is great with emotion, is he makes the emotion tied to the setting, not just the person. That's what we normally do. And I know I'm guilty of this. I tie all the emotion to the person, but it's not. It's the whole scene. The person is one element. The character is one element in the action, and the scene is another element. And you can set the whole tone with this, with that setting, by getting that all laid out properly and putting a tone into it and a grayness if it's a like a depressing kind of thing or a dangerous kind of thing, a black night or whatever it might be. And that will be be transferred right into the character, and the reader gets a much richer experience out of it.
I cannot agree more. I don't think setting gets nearly the props that it should. All about setting. I love setting, and I think I'm not even opposed to starting with setting myself, but you're absolutely right. A lot of the emotion that our characters feel stem from the setting around them, and when they're feeling something profound, they're going to memorize that particular moment. So they're going to be consciously very aware of their surroundings and the impact that those surroundings are having on them. So some really good stuff establishing those tones. Absolutely.
Yeah. So emotion goes beyond the person. It goes into the setting as well. And boy, if you can get that down, you're going to be one of the great writers. It's probably difficult to master, at least for mere humans like me. But, I give it a try. And I try to set up the scene so that the emotion reflects. I was looking at something in Wounds, looking for an example here. And the very first page of the first chapter, the first word is flies. And when you're reading that, you don't know what that means, but just within a couple lines, you realize you're at a murder scene and the flies are on the body. And it's a little disgusting, and my character is disgusted. So we went from the scene right into the character, and the character shares a common emotion with the setting. Now, no reader's going to sit back and go, my, what a fine way of doing that. They're just going to feel it. It's going to catch them like a punch in the brain. And that is what will stay with them for really forever.
Yeah. By the way, getting punched in the brain really hurts. I'm just throwing that out there. So if you can ever avoid it, try not to get punched in the brain. So, or the heart. That one also hurts too. But.
That probably came. I've been reviewing a book I'm going to republish, and I have a line in there. I gave myself a slap across the brain. It's in first person. The character says, I gave myself a slap across the brain. For some reason, that stuck with me.
So. Yeah, I'd keep, now I'm picturing a hand stuck in a brain in the frontal lobe. Oh, I just smacked the brain and it's stuck.
We're almost out of time here. So maybe we run through some things to do and maybe some things to avoid. Let me do the things to avoid real quick. Give up any need to manipulate the reader. The more you try to do that, the more you will fail at it. Don't do that. Tell the story. Don't use unauthentic emotion. We won't talk about that much because we've already talked about it. And then overwritten purple prose, which you have brought up time again. Don't go so far as to make the words themselves the characters. Set a beautiful scene or a tense scene or whatever it might be, but set that scene, and that's a good. And remember, the reader is going to look at these things visually because we are visual people, and movies and television have changed the way we think. So you want to be as visually rich as possible. How about some things to do?
You want to trust your readers. Again, you don't want to repeat yourself. You don't want to say the same thing over and over. You don't want to, find different ways to say the same things. All right, enough of that. You want to show emotion. There's always the people who want to say that oh, my character doesn't feel emotion. I mean, even Spock shows emotion occasionally. You know what I'm saying? And the Vulcans are notorious for burying their emotions. And then, of course, there's some great episodes of Star Trek where that all kind of comes out. One of the greatest episodes of Star Trek, The Next Generation. Look at me being sidetracked very easily. Is where Spock's father comes back, and it's basically every emotion that he's ever repressed in his life has come back, and it's kind of like this form of dementia, kind of a Vulcan Alzheimer's, if you will, and very powerful episode, very, very powerful episode. If you get a chance to see it, I can't remember what it's called, but it's pretty fantastic. So don't be afraid to show emotion. Everybody feels it. Remember, people feel things differently. Different stimulus is going to create different emotions. Remember that emotion is the seasoning. It's salt, extracts from everything else, from all the other flavors that you're working on with setting and character and plot. So don't overdo it. Remember to ask yourself: is this emotion gender specific? How does my character react to this? And how do they feel about it? And is it staying with them? How is this going to affect not them right now, but through the course of the novel and even beyond? So those are some things to do.
Yeah, and a little practice, those things will really serve the writer well. On the gender specific, you mentioned a couple of things that men tend to withdraw from emotions. Now, you don't have to be locked into that. You don't want to be stereotypical, because a very well-known writer that I know is a woman, but we always accuse her of having a man's brain, because that's the way she communicates. And so she's a little different, and I've seen it in her books that some of her characters come out that way. So you're not locked into that. You just want to consider it. Make your decisions based on that. And I think that's really pretty much it. We've covered some of the other things on our list there.
Mm-hmm.
So go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Quotidian Light has joined us, and she mentions that she does a Literary Roadhouse podcast. For those of you who don't recall that, and she says,
shout out.
Yeah, shout out. It's good. You should download it, but listen to him. She says she selfishly started that podcast so that she could read more, because reading good fiction really helps her fiction as well. So that's, I guess, one other thing to put on our things to do list. Read a lot. Always be reading. So that's
and read with an academic's mind. If you read something that's good, stop and savor it. Figure out what the person did. Other readers can just read and move on. But if you find something that really works and you want to be a writer, then the thing to do is you need to stop and say, all right, what has this author done? Why is this working? Why is Bradbury's description so good, and Dean Koontz's settings so good, and some of the other things? Find out what they're doing right. Instead of trying to find, well, people wouldn't write that way today. Sometimes I wish they would.
Right.
And have some better material.
Read with purpose. And I would say read the first time to enjoy, read the second time with a pen in hand, make some notes. I know some people freak out. Oh, no, I would never, ever write in my book, ever. I mean, it's like a love note, I think, to the author. If I ever see a copy of The Bargain with marginal comments all throughout, I wouldn't stop grinning for weeks. It'd be like the greatest thing. So that's my own personal take. Might be in the minority there, but there it is. So, well, any last minute comments there, Pops?
No, I think that's it. Dave Fezino just sent something. I was waiting for it to pop up on the screen. He loves the phrase, again, don't repeat yourself. I never repeat myself. What? I said I never repeat myself.
Right, exactly. So that's fun. But yeah, how can people get in touch with you, Pops?
AltonGansky.com is the way to go. Book for The Harbinger. You can get the physical copy now through Amazon. You can get the ebook on, I think, May 1st, if you'd like to do that. So, and if you're going to do that, you might get the other ones first. They're fairly cheap, and you might get the other one so you can lead up to what I'm doing in the fourth book. And then once you've read the fourth book, you'll be ready for the fifth book by Bill Myers. And then the one after that's by Frank Peretti.
Excellent. And as always, you guys can find me on aarongansky.com. You can find us on our YouTube channel and subscribe on iTunes. Leave us nice notes and good comments. And you can find me on the Twitter too. But aarongansky.com is kind of your one-stop shop there. You'll find me there. And we thank you all for listening. And until next week, good writing.